The sensor did not scream. It just stopped knowing. Technician Sarah Voss had been on shift for 3 hours and 40 minutes when the display changed. She had a cup of something warm near her left elbow. She had a playlist running low in her earpiece. She had 41 more minutes before handoff, and she had been thinking about going to sleep. Then the screen went gray. Not the gray of static, not the gray of malfunction. There was a specific gray in the Imperial Sensor Codex, listed on page 412, that she had read once during training and never thought about again. A gray so rare that the codex had a footnote underneath it that said, simply, "If you see this color, do not assume equipment failure. Escalate immediately." She stared at the gray. She escalated. Commander Veth Salis of the Imperial Fleet received the alert at 0312 station time. He was not asleep. Men like Veth Salis did not sleep deeply near the edges of Imperial space. They dozed, half-dressed, one hand near their comm unit, and they woke fully formed, the way a soldier is supposed to. He was in the sensor bay in 4 minutes. Voss was still at her station. She had not moved. She had not touched her drink. She was looking at the gray the way people look at something they do not have words for yet. Veth Salis stood beside her and looked at the display. The object was 4.7 million kilometers out. It was large. The mass readings put it somewhere between a heavy cruiser and a mobile station. It had a drive signature. He could see the heat bloom of it, far and faint, which meant it was not debris, not a dead rock, not a phantom reading. Something was pushing it. It was moving at a steady, deliberate speed. It was not slowing down. Cross-reference the registry, Veth Salis said. Voss had already done it. She pulled up the results without speaking. 0. He looked at her. She looked at him. Run it again, he said. She ran it again. 0. The Imperial Ship Registry contained 14,211,000 entries. Every vessel that had ever been built, bought, stolen, captured, decommissioned, destroyed, or dreamed of within Imperial space for the last 400 years had an entry. Drive signatures were as unique as fingerprints. You could not fake one, not without the Empire knowing, not without leaving a trace. The gray ship left no trace. Full cross-reference, he said. All sectors, all registries, every Allied database we have access to. Voss pulled up the cross-reference panel and started the run. It would take 11 minutes. Veth Salis stood and watched the number on the screen, 4.7 million kilometers, and watched it change. Sidar low. Sidar woo. It did not slow down. The cross-reference came back in 9 minutes and 40 seconds. 847 ships listed in the sector registry. 14 million in the Central Imperial Archive. 62,000 in the Allied database, covering 6 neighboring systems. Every single one returned 0. Veth Salis sat down. This was unusual. In 40 years, he had sat down unexpectedly exactly once, and that had been because someone had moved his chair at the wrong moment. He was not a man who sat when he meant to stand. But he sat now, and he did not notice he had done it. He looked at the drive signature readings again. The object, he was still calling it an object. Because giving it a name felt like a decision, he was not ready to make burned fuel in a particular way. All drives did. The burn pattern was like a signature. You could tell what kind of drive it was, how old, what class of vessel it probably belonged to. The analysis came back flagged. He read the flag 3 times. Drive signature type, unclassified. Fuel burn pattern, no match in database. Hull reflection frequency. Obsolete range sensors, calibrated for this frequency, were decommissioned approximately 280 years ago. Veth Salis set the report down. He picked it back up. He set it down again. The object was 3.9 million kilometers out, still not slowing. By 0400, the sensor bay had 6 more people in it than it was built for. Veth Salis had called in his senior analyst, Lieutenant Commander Dara Hess, and she had brought her own people, and someone had called the station's chief engineer to look at the sensor array itself because 3 people had quietly suggested, in the way people suggest things they do not want to be right about, that perhaps the sensors were malfunctioning. The chief engineer looked at the sensors for 20 minutes. The sensors were not malfunctioning. The object was 3.4 million kilometers out. Hess stood at the main display with a hand on her chin, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was solving a problem she did not like the shape of. She was good at her job. She had been good at her job for 15 years. And in 15 years, she had learned to trust the shape of problems, the way a doctor learns to trust symptoms. The shape of this problem was very bad. Hull material analysis, she said. The scan had already been run. Voss pulled up the results. The hull of the object absorbed sensor pings at a rate inconsistent with any known material in the Imperial construction database. It was not that the material was new. The absorption rate matched several old entries materials used in the early colonial era, before standardization, before the Empire had decided what ships were supposed to be made of. That hull was built a long time ago, Hess said. Or someone built it to look old, one of her analysts offered. She looked at him in a way that made him look at his shoes. With materials we don't have anymore, she said. Using a drive we stopped cataloging 280 years ago. Running without any identifier, any beacon, any standard approach signal. She paused. Does that sound like a disguise to you? The analyst studied his shoes very carefully. It sounds like something that doesn't know it's supposed to identify itself, Hess continued. Or something that knows, and has decided not to. The room was quiet for a moment. Cross-reference the registry, Vethsalis said. His voice was the same as it always was. Flat. Professional. The voice of a man who had given the same order 4 times now. Nobody pointed this out. The object was 2.8 million kilometers out when someone suggested it might be debris. Moving under power, Hess said. A derelict then. Automated systems still running. The drive output is too consistent for automated drift management. Something is actively controlling thrust. Could be ancient programming. Colonial-era automation was, something is actively controlling thrust, Hess said again, not louder. Just the same words, placed more carefully. The suggestion died. Someone else suggested a sensor malfunction. They had already established the sensors were not malfunctioning, but people suggest things twice when they are afraid the first answer was wrong. Vethsalis let it run. He ordered a secondary sensor sweep from the array on the station's far side. The secondary sweep returned the same readings. Same mass, same drive signature, same hull material, same gray on the screen. 2,6 million kilometers. It was Voss who noticed the course change. She had been watching the trajectory calculations on a secondary display, the numbers updating every 30 seconds. And she had been doing the small mechanical thing of watching without fully seeing, the way you watch something for a long time that does not move. And then it moved. Not a drift. Not a wobble. A clean, calculated shift. Commander. Her voice was very quiet. The room heard it anyway. Vethsalis looked at the trajectory overlay she was pulling up. The old course was shown in white. The new course was shown in a dull orange, because orange was the color the system used when a recalculated trajectory pointed toward an Imperial asset. The old course would have taken the object through the system at a long angle, passing at closest approach about 1.1 million kilometers from the station. The new course pointed at the fleet, not the station, the fleet. As if something on board had looked at the sensor returns it was getting, the Imperial sensor pings bouncing off its hull, and looked at the formation of ships surrounding the station, and made a choice about which one mattered more. The room stopped breathing. It responded to us, Hess said. She sounded like someone saying something out loud that they did not want to be true. It felt our scans. It adjusted. Vethsalis stood up. He had not noticed he was sitting again. Battle stations? He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time for a decision like this. In 40 years he had called battle stations twice. Both times there had been something to fight. A ship with a flag, with a drive signature, with a registry entry, with crew who had reasons for being there that could be understood. This had no flag, no registry, no reasons he could find. He thought about what battle stations looked like from the outside. Weapons hot, fleet in formation. A very clear signal sent to something that was already approaching. And he thought, and this was the thought that took 3 of his 4 seconds, about what it meant that the thing out there had already adjusted course once, deliberately, when it knew they were watching. Hail it, he said. The hail went out at 0441. Standard Imperial greeting protocol. 17 dialects, 4 trade languages, 2 formal scripts. Transmitted on all standard bands. On several old colonial-era bands that communications had to look up the frequencies for, and on the emergency universal signal, that had not been used in the sector for 16 years. Then they waited. 2,2 million kilometers. Ardeni. The object did not respond. Try again, Veth Salas said. They tried again. Hess suggested sending the hail in binary pulse, old mathematical pattern, the kind of first contact protocol used in the early expansion era, when you were not sure if the thing you were talking to had language. They sent that too. Nothing. 1,9 million kilometers. Hess was pulling every archived record she could access, old contact reports, anomaly logs, anything from this sector or neighboring sectors that mentioned unregistered vessels, unknown drive signatures, hull materials from the colonial era. She had 4 people running searches in parallel. She was doing what people who are good at their jobs do when they do not know the answer, which is, search every room in the building until one of them has a window they can see through. She had not found a window yet. 1,7 million kilometers. If it doesn't respond before 1.5, Veth Salas said, we go to battle stations. Nobody argued. It was the right call. It was a reasonable line to draw. He knew as he said it that it was also the most useless line he had ever drawn in his career, because whatever was on that ship was going to do exactly what it had already decided to do, and a fleet in battle formation was not going to change that math. He said it anyway, because it was the right thing to say, and because 40 years of the right thing to say was the only tool he had. Lo. Then the comm board lit up. The signal was not on any of the bands they had used to hail it. It was on a frequency so old that the communications officer, a young man named Rel who was very good at his job and who had now been awake for 19 hours, had to physically go into the archive room and pull a hardware adapter to receive it. The frequency was in the Colonial Era Communications Index, in a section labeled Times Retired, No Active Users. It took 11 minutes to get the adapter hooked in. In those 11 minutes, nobody in the sensor bay spoke. Veth Salas watched the object 1.55 million kilometers now, inside the line he had drawn, and he did not call battle stations, because the signal was coming in. And calling battle stations while the thing was trying to talk to you was the kind of decision that ended careers, or wars, or both. The signal resolved. It was audio, not video, just a voice. And the translation matrix, which processed language input and matched it to known languages in the Imperial database, went through 17 dialects and 4 trade tongues, and stopped, flagged, and produced a result that Veth Salas read, and then read again. Language group, old trade standard variant unknown, secondary components, unidentified, estimated language age, 300-900 years, translation, confidence, 61%. 61%. The matrix had never returned 61%. It had returned 99, 100, sometimes 94 for heavy dialect. It had never returned 61. That number meant the language existed in the database. It was close enough to something known, but it had been changed, shifted, grown in directions the database did not have records for. A language grew like that when it was cut off, when it had nobody to compare itself to for a very long time. The voice spoke for 42 seconds. The translation came through in fragments, patchy in places, clear in others. This is untranslatable. Vessel. Designation. Untranslatable. 2. We have been watching, waiting, attending matrix uncertain. Registry. Known, acknowledged, understood to be. Empty. Silent. Void. We are aware. Prepared. Ready. Requesting, announcing, declaring approach. The room processed this. Voss spoke first, which surprised her. They know, she said. They know they're not in the registry. Hess was already running the voice signal through the matrix again, trying to get the confidence higher. They said they've been watching, or waiting. She looked up. Waiting for what? Nobody answered. 1,5 million kilometers. Past the line he had drawn. Veth Salas did not call battle stations. Get me a video link, he said. Whatever we need to do to open one, do it. It took 22 minutes to establish a visual connection, because the object was running on communications hardware that the Empire's systems took a very long time to handshake with. The process looked, to the communications officer, like trying to get 2 very old people who spoke different languages to shake hands in a dark room. They managed it. The screen resolved. The bridge of the other ship was lit in a warm, low tone, nothing like the clean white light of Imperial vessels. The walls were dark. The equipment looked old, not broken, not failing, but aged. Worn the way things get worn when they have been used for a very long time by people who treated them carefully. There were 3 people visible. The one in the center sitting where a captain sits was a woman, middle-aged, dark skin, gray spreading from her temples. She wore a uniform that no registry in the Empire had ever catalogued. There were no rank markings on it that Vethsalis could identify. Just a name, the ship's name, he realized, stitched above the breast pocket in faded thread. ISV Patience. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a thing they have been expecting for a very long time. She did not introduce herself. She said, in old trade standard, slowly enough that the Matrix caught 91% of it. We've been patient. And then she waited. The ship was 1.4 million kilometers out, and it was still not slowing down, and Vethsalis looked at the woman on his screen and understood, somewhere in the part of him that 40 years of protocol had not quite reached, that she was not asking permission to approach. She was informing him. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, finally, the only thing he knew how to say. Cross-reference the registry. Hess looked at him. He knew. He knew there was nothing in the registry. He said it anyway, because it was the only floor he had left to stand on, and the floor was about to give. Her name was Mara Ose. This was not information she gave him. Vethsalis had to ask 3 times, through the translation matrix, across 1.4 million kilometers of open space. And she answered on the 3rd ask, not because the first 2 did not register, but because she was measuring something. What she was measuring he could not say. He got the feeling she measured most things before she answered them, and that she had gotten very good at it over a very long time. She was the captain of the ISV Patience. She said this simply. The way you say a thing that has been true for so long that saying it doesn't require any weight behind it. Captain of the ISV Patience. The sun rises in the east. Water is cold in space. Vethsalis asked what ISV stood for. She looked at him the way a person looks at a question they find mildly interesting. Interstellar vessel, she said. It's what we call our ships. It is not an imperial designation. No, she agreed. It's not. The ship did not stop. That was the thing Vethsalis kept returning to during those first 40 minutes of conversation, because stopping was what ships did when they were approaching a fleet they had not been authorized to approach. They stopped, they asked. They waited for clearance. It was the most fundamental piece of approach protocol in the Imperial Code, written in the first volume of the first edition, because it was so basic that people had thought it did not need to be written down, and then twice in the first decade of expansion people had died because they had not done it. The ISV Patience did not stop. It slowed, eventually. Not because Vethsalis asked it to, though he did ask. It slowed because it had reached the distance it had decided to stop at, which turned out to be 400,000 kilometers, and it held there with a precision that his fleet's navigation officer said was almost unsettling to watch. Most ships drifted a little when they held position. The Patience held like it was nailed to a fixed point in space. I need you to identify your vessel, Vethsalis said, for what he calculated was approximately the 7th time across the conversation in various forms. Registry code, port of registration, flag authority. Ose listened to all of this very calmly. Your registry doesn't have us, she said. We know. We checked. When did you check? She leaned back slightly in her chair. The movement was not impatient. It was the movement of someone settling in for a conversation that they knew was going to take a while, and who had decided they were fine with that. We've been checking, she said, for 112 years. The translation matrix had gotten better during the conversation. It was up to 87% confidence now. This was partly because the matrix was adaptive. The longer it processed a voice, the better it got at its patterns, and partly because Ose was being very deliberate about her speech. Not slow, just deliberate. She was shaping her words for the matrix, and she knew she was doing it, which meant she had known the matrix would be used before she called. She had prepared for this conversation. Vethsalis thought about how long someone had to prepare for something to be this ready. 112 years, she had said. Checking the registry. That number did not make sense unless the checking was generational. unless multiple people across multiple years had done the checking and kept records and passed those records down. He did not say this out loud. He filed it in the part of his mind where he put things he needed to come back to. "Where did you come from?" he asked. She gave him coordinates. He had Hess run the coordinates on a secondary screen where Osei could not see the results. Hess pulled up the sector chart and found the coordinates, and then looked at Vethsalis with a very specific expression. The expression of someone who has found a window and does not like the view. He looked at the coordinates on the secondary screen. They fell in the old border sector, the far edge of it, where imperial expansion had reached, and then, for reasons the historical record listed as times stellar incident times, had stopped. A cluster of colonial settlements, 300 years ago, gone dark, no survivors reported. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at Osei. He did not ask the question yet. He was not ready for the answer. "Who are you?" he said instead. Simpler, the most basic version of what he needed to know. She considered this with the same quiet attention she gave everything. "We are the people who were there," she said, "when your empire decided we weren't." The translation matrix flagged the sentence at 91%, which meant 9% might be wrong, which meant, he could tell himself, the 9% included the most important parts. He could tell himself that. He did not. "I don't know what that means," he said. And then, because 40 years of the Imperial Code had drilled honesty into his professional vocabulary, "I'd like to." She looked at him differently after that. Not warmer, not softer, but different in some way that he filed alongside the other things he was keeping. "We know," she said. "We know you don't have the records. We know your archive is empty." She paused. "We have the records. We've been keeping them." "Records of what?" "Of being forgotten," she said. "Records of what that looks like, what it costs, what it takes to survive it." She paused again. "Records of us." The fleet was in loose formation around the station. Vethsalis had not formally called battle stations, but the fleet commander, Admiral Sora, had moved ships into a tighter pattern over the last 2 hours, quietly, without announcement, the way experienced officers do things when they are not sure if they are about to need to do them, but they want to be ready. The Patience was at 400,000 kilometers, holding absolutely still, and the Imperial ships had formed a loose shell around the station at about 200,000. In theory, the Patience could not pass them without authorization. Vethsalis thought about the word times theory times for a moment. He thought about a ship that was not in any registry, with a hull from a dead era and a drive signature that matched nothing alive. He thought about a ship that had approached a fully armed Imperial fleet and had not stopped until it decided to stop, and had not changed course until it decided to change course. He thought about the woman sitting on the other side of the screen who was talking to him like someone finishing a sentence they had started 300 years ago. In theory. He moved on. Hess slid a datapad onto the edge of his console while Osei was speaking. He glanced at it without picking it up. It had one line on it, in Hess's handwriting, actual handwriting, not typed, because she did not trust the communication logs for things like this. "They are not alone." He did not react. He had gotten very good at not reacting over 40 years. He kept his eyes on Osei, kept his voice at the same level, kept the conversation going in the same direction it had been going, but he moved his hand over the pad, covering the line, and he pressed his thumb down once. Hess would understand. She would run the extended sensor sweep. She would find what she found and she would tell him, and he would deal with that when the time came. Right now, he had a conversation to finish. "I need to ask you something," he said. "You can ask anything," Osei said. "Whether I answer it depends on whether it's a question we've already answered ourselves. Why come now? If you've been..." He paused. "If your people have been there for 300 years, why now?" It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the gray appeared on Voss's screen. Osei was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a thing to say. "We needed to be ready," she said finally. "Ready to come. Ready to stay. Ready for whatever the conversation turned into." She looked at him steadily. "That takes time. It takes more time than you might think, to be ready for all three. And are you? Ready?" "Yes." The word was so flat, so entirely without drama, that it landed harder than anything else she had said. He believed her. "What do you want?" he asked. This was the question, the real one. Everything else had been a wall around this question, both of them walking around it, getting closer. Osei did not answer immediately. She reached somewhere off-screen and picked something up, he could not see what, and she looked at it briefly, and she put it back. He had the feeling it was a document, something old and handled, with the softness of paper that had been folded and unfolded 100 times. "We want what was taken from us," she said. "Formally, officially, on record, in your archive, in every database that erased us." She looked at him. "We want our name back. Your name. We have a name. We've always had a name. Your empire removed it from every record it kept, and we have been without it, officially, for 300 years. Her voice did not change. It was very level, very steady. "We want it back. We want the seat at the table that was never offered. We want acknowledgement of what was done." She paused. "And then we want to participate, in your councils, in your decisions, in the things that happen in this galaxy, which is also our galaxy." Vethsalis looked at her. He thought about the size of that ask, the political mass of it, the councils it would require, the debates, the factions, the history he did not fully know but could feel the shape of at the edges of the conversation. He thought about the fact that she had said times what was taken, not times what we lost, that she had said times removed, not times forgotten, that her language was very precise about who had done what to whom. "And if we refuse?" he said. He expected something, a threat, a named consequence, something to put in the report, something to file under Times, leverage Times, so he could look at it and understand the shape of what he was dealing with. Osei looked at him. She did not answer. She folded her hands on the console in front of her, and she looked at him with the patience of someone who had come a very long way and had a very long time, and she said, "Take your time." The call ended 20 minutes later. Osei ended it not abruptly, but with a finality that was easy to mistake for politeness, the way an experienced negotiator ends a meeting by making leaving seem mutual. The patience continued to hold at 400,000 kilometers. Vethsalis stood in the sensor bay for a long time. The room had emptied slightly. It was nearly 0600 now, and people needed things like food and rest, though most of them were taking those things nearby and coming back quickly, because nobody wanted to be the person who was in the bathroom when something happened. Hess came to stand beside him. "Extended sweep is back," she said. "How many?" She had not told him there were ships. He had covered her note with his hand. She looked at him for a moment, because he had gotten to the right answer without the information, and she was noting that, filing it, the way she filed things. 47, she said, all dark, no active emissions. Quote, "Where?" She pulled up the sector overlay on the main display. 47 points, spread through the surrounding space. She had asked the navigation officer to check the formation geometry, and the navigation officer had come back to her with a look. She recognized the look of someone who had run a check and run it again, because they did not believe the first answer. The ships were arranged in a geometric pattern of exact precision, mathematically even spacing, an orientation that put each ship's optimal firing arc, covering a section of space that no other ship's arc covered. It was a formation that had been planned, and planned carefully, by someone who knew exactly what Imperial fleet doctrine looked like. "They know how we fight," Hess said. "They know how we fight," Vethsalis agreed. He looked at the 47 dark points on the display. None of them had moved. None of them had powered up. None of them were broadcasting anything. They were just there, holding position, the same way the patience was holding position with that unsettling, absolute stillness. He thought about the woman on the screen, the folded hands, the patience in the word itself times take your time times that was not an offer. That was a fact about the people saying it. People who had been waiting for 112 years while they checked a registry that did not have them. People who had been waiting, before that, for 300 years, before they were ready. "Get me Admiral Sora," he said. He picked up his tea, because it was there, and he had forgotten about it and his hands needed something. It was cold. He drank it anyway, because the next few hours were not going to give him anything better. And cold tea was still tea, and small familiar things were the only steady ground he had left. Archivist Len had not left the records division in 11 days. This was not unusual. He often went 11, 12, sometimes 16 days without leaving, because the records division had everything he needed. Tea, a sleeping cot behind the west stack, a small window that showed a piece of sky that was technically outside, which he counted. He was 71 years old, and he had worked in the records division for 43 of those years. And in that time, the rest of the station had come to think of him as part of the building. Fixtures do not leave. They are just there when you need them. He was there when the request came in. It arrived at 0823, flagged at clearance level 17. He had clearance level 9. Level 17 was a number he had technically been aware of. It existed in the administrative code, the same way the far edge of a very large building exists. You know it is there. You do not expect to ever stand near it. He looked at the flag for a long time. The request was simple. A record search. 300 years of sector history. Filtered by colony clusters. The old border zone. The specific stellar coordinates that had been included in the flagged request. The search had already been partially run at the fleet command level by people with clearance level 12 and 13, and they had found references to a file, and the file had been found to be sealed, and the sealed file had been escalated until it arrived, eventually, and somewhat inevitably, at his desk, because his desk was where things arrived when they had gone everywhere else. He made himself a cup of tea. He thought about it. He ran the search. The file was not missing. Missing was a specific thing in the archive. Missing meant a gap in the record, a reference that pointed to a file that no longer existed, like a door in a wall that led to no room. Missing files left holes you could see and measure. This file was sealed. Sealed meant it had existed as an open record once, and someone had reached into the archive and put a lock on it. Sealed meant there was content behind the lock. Sealed meant someone, at some point, had read it and then decided that other people should not. It took him 40 minutes to navigate the clearance structure of the seal. The seal itself was 307 years old, which meant the clearance structure it used was an old one, which meant it had vulnerabilities that modern seals did not have, which meant that a 71-year-old archivist with 43 years of experience could, with patience and the right approach, find a way through it. He found his way through it. He was not proud of this. He also was not ashamed of it. He was an archivist. An archivist's job was to know what the archive contained. He could not properly do his job without access to the archive's contents. This logic was very clean, in his mind. The file opened. He read the header. He put his tea down. The file was a colonial survey record, 307 years old. The format was an old one, early imperial expansion era, before the standardized forms, when each survey office had its own way of doing things. But the structure was familiar. Survey date, coordinates, species classification, estimated population, strategic assessment. He read the classification header first. Species, Terran, common name, human, homeworld, Sol 3, designation, Earth. He had not heard those words in a professional context in his entire career. He pulled up the current registry, a habit, the reflex of an archivist, and searched for them. The registry returned nothing. Earth, Sol 3. Human, Terran, nothing. He went back to the file. Expansion status. Colonial phase, third wave. Colony clusters active. 14. Estimated total population at time of survey. Redacted. He stared at the redaction. It was thorough, not just the number, but the unit. He could not even tell if it was hundreds or millions. He scrolled. Most of the file was intact, in the way that old files are intact, slightly worn at the edges, phrasing that belonged to a different century, references to political structures and imperial departments that no longer existed, survey reports on each of the 14 colony clusters, population data by cluster, resource assessments, agricultural capacity, drive technology levels, cultural observations, a note about trade potential, and then, near the end, a section header. Imperial Administrative Decision Case, 7.441. Under this header, completely redacted. Every word. Not just the text, the metadata, the author field, the date field, even the department field. Whoever had done the redacting had been very careful. They had not wanted anyone to know who had made this decision, from which office, on which specific day, but they had not deleted the header. The header said Times, administrative decision, which was a specific phrase in the imperial bureaucratic code. It meant the decision had been made deliberately, at a level of authority that required documentation, and that it had been applied to the species or population described in the preceding sections. An administrative decision, about 14 colony clusters. Len sat very still. He scrolled to the survey notes section. The body of the file, before the redactions, was mostly intact. He read through the cultural observation section slowly, because he was an archivist and he read things properly. The survey officers had been thorough. There were notes about language, multiple languages, even within the Terran species, which the survey officer had found unusual enough to flag. Notes about social structures, notes about conflict patterns and resolution patterns, notes about technological adaptation speed, which had been flagged as notable, and then, at the bottom of the cultural observation section, a subnote from the original cataloging officer, not the survey officer, a different person, junior, someone who had processed the file when it was first submitted and added a routine observation before filing it. One line. It was the only part of the file that had not been redacted. He looked at it for a long time, trying to decide if it had been missed intentionally or by accident. He decided it was by accident. It was in the subnote field, which was a low-importance administrative field, not the kind of place a careful redactor would think to look. Subjects display unusual persistence under adverse conditions. Recommend continued monitoring. He read it 3 more times. Unusual persistence under adverse conditions. He thought about the ship that had appeared outside the station. He thought about the woman on the screen who had said, calmly and without drama, that they had been checking the registry for 112 years. He thought about 47 dark ships, holding perfect formation, which had been sitting out there for how long? Days? Longer? In total silence, waiting. Unusual persistence. He thought that the survey officer who wrote that line had been more accurate than they knew. The hardest part was the coordinate cross-reference. He had the coordinates from the fleet's report, the coordinates Osei had given Vethsalis during the first contact call, which had been included in the escalation package that had come with the sealed file request. The coordinates of where the ISV Patience and its fleet had originated from. He ran them against the Colonial Survey file. Colony Cluster 7. He pulled up the colonial history records for Cluster 7 unsealed. Because they were not sealed, they were simply old and largely unread. Survey completed 307 years ago. Population established. Trade routes proposed. And then an entry, 14 years after the survey. Cluster 7 status update. Communication lost. Investigation dispatched. And then, 4 months later, investigation report. Stellar incident. Colony sites, uninhabitable, no survivors, identified, and then nothing. No follow-up. No memorial record. No salvage report. No detailed investigation findings, which was unusual, because Imperial investigation reports were long and detailed and they documented everything, down to what was found and what was not found. The investigation report was 3 sentences. Len had been in the archive for 43 years, and he had read a great many reports. And he knew what a thorough one looked like, and he knew what a thin one looked like, and he knew, with the certainty that only comes from 4 decades of reading documents, that no actual investigation had produced a 3-sentence report. The report had been written to close the file, not to explain what happened. To close it, he pulled up the dates carefully. The Colonial Survey, 307 years ago. The communication loss, 314 years ago. No, wait, he had misread. He pulled up the dates again. Communication loss, 14 years after the survey. Imperial Administrative Decision, Case 7.441. The date field was redacted, but he cross-referenced the file version numbers, which were not redacted, and the version numbers corresponded to a specific era of the Imperial filing system, which he could date to within a 4-year window. The administrative decision had been made approximately 8 to 12 years before the communication loss. He stopped. He reread this. The administrative decision had come first, before the colonies went silent, before the stellar incident, before the 3-sentence investigation report. He sat with that for a long time. He had been in the archive for 43 years. He had processed thousands of colonial-era records. He knew how colonies went dark. He knew what stellar incidents looked like in the record, the scramble of emergency reports, the investigation that filled 40 pages, the follow-up surveys, the debates about colony placement policy that followed any genuine catastrophic loss. He knew what a genuine stellar incident looked like in the record. This did not look like a genuine stellar incident. This looked like a decision, followed by a silence that had been very carefully shaped to look like an accident. He wrote up his findings, slowly, carefully, the way he did everything. He used precise language and he did not make claims beyond what the documents supported, because he was an archivist and that was the rule. He noted the seal and its age. He noted the redactions and their scope. He noted the survey findings and the administrative decision header and the subnote and the coordinate cross-reference and the discrepancy in the investigation report length. He did not write a conclusion. He wrote, "The enclosed documents, reviewed in sequence, present a pattern that the receiving officer may wish to investigate further." He attached the full file. He marked it urgent and sent it up the chain to Hess, who had requested it, and to Veth Salas, who had clearance for it now that it had been through his desk, and to 3 other addresses that were on the mandatory escalation list for sealed files of this age and classification. Then he made another cup of tea. He took it to his small window, the one that showed the piece of sky he counted as outside, and he stood there, and he looked at the stars. Somewhere in those stars, 300 years ago, a survey officer had written a subnote in a low-importance administrative field, and had probably forgotten they had written it 5 minutes later. A small, routine observation about the people they had just catalogued. Unusual persistence under adverse conditions. He thought about persistence. The specific kind it took to be erased from a record, from a registry, from the official memory of an entire civilization, and not to break, to survive, to build, in the dark, away from every database and archive and record-keeping system that had decided you did not exist. To keep your own records instead. To pass them down. To teach your children and their children's children what they were called, where they came from, what had been done to them, and to keep that knowledge alive for 300 years without the validation of a single official document. He thought about the ship named Patience. He thought the people who flew it had earned the name. His comm unit chimed. "Hess. Len. The file you sent. Yes. The coordinate cross-reference. And? Yes." A pause. He could hear her reading, or rereading, or re-rereading, the way people did when they found something they wanted to have read differently. "The administrative decision came before the incident," she said. "Yes." Another pause. "Does the file have any indication of what the administrative decision actually said?" "No. It's fully redacted. Can you get through it?" He looked at his tea. He thought about clearance levels and archival ethics, and the rules that governed his job, and the reason those rules existed. "I will need some time," he said. "How much time?" "An hour. Perhaps 2. "Oh?" A pause that felt like Hess deciding something. "Do it," she said. And then, quietly, in the voice of someone who already knew the answer to the question they were asking, "What do you think it says?" Len looked out his small window at the sky that he counted as outside. "I think," he said, "that it says what every sealed file from this era says. Someone made a decision about a people. The people were considered inconvenient, or dangerous, or simply in the way of something else that the Empire wanted." He paused. "And the file was sealed because the decision was not the kind that looks good in an archive." Silence on the line. "Those 47 ships out there," Hess said. "They came from Cluster 7. "Yes. And they've been there for 300 years. "Yes. And the women on that ship said they've been checking our registry for 112 years. "Yes." Hess was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing. "They waited until they were ready," she said. "Not a question." "The subnote in the file," Len said, "describes the species as demonstrating unusual persistence under adverse conditions." He paused. "I believe that assessment was correct." He heard Hess set down something heavy on her desk. "An hour," she said. "Get me what you can." The line went quiet. Len turned back to his window. The tea in his mug had gone cold. He noticed this in the simple, uncomplicated way he noticed most things. It was a fact. Like the date on the file, like the 3-sentence investigation report, like the coordinate match. He drank it cold, Because cold tea was still something to hold while you stood at a window and thought about 300 years of very deliberate waiting. He thought about it for a long time. Then he went back to work. The shuttle docked at 1,400 on the second day. It was a small craft older than anything in the Imperial fleet, running on the same drive technology as the Patience, which the station's docking system had to be manually walked through how to receive. The engineer who did the walking through said afterward that it was like explaining to a modern door how to open for someone who knocked instead of using the panel. The door could do it. It just had to remember a skill it had not used in a very long time. 3 people came off the shuttle. Osei was in the center. The same uniform, the same ship name above the pocket. She had added nothing for the occasion, no formal wear, no insignia, no decorative markers of rank or status. She wore exactly what she had worn on the screen, in the same worn, familiar way, like someone who did not dress for rooms. She dressed for work, and the work was the same wherever she was. The 2 people with her were younger, a man and a woman, both carrying small cases, both moving with a calm that looked practiced, not nervous, not performing calm, actually calm, in the specific way of people who have been prepared for something for a very long time. Veth Salas was waiting in the docking bay. He had Admiral Sora beside him, and 2 members of the station's diplomatic staff, and 6 security personnel positioned at the appropriate intervals. Protocol. He had done everything protocol required, and protocol required a great deal. It was the work of the morning, laying out the protocol. It had given him something to do while Len's findings were making their way through his head. Osei walked across the docking bay and she looked at the line of them, Veth Salas, Sora, the diplomats, the security, and she stopped at a comfortable distance, and she waited. He introduced himself, formally, in full title. She nodded. Mara Osei, she said. Captain of the ISV Patience, speaking for the Remnant Fleet. The Remnant Fleet. He had not heard that phrase before. He filed it. Welcome to Imperial Station Kale 7, he said. Because that was the thing you said. Thank you, she said. Because that was the thing you said back. They went to the meeting room. The meeting room was on the station's diplomatic level, a room built for encounters like this, with a long table and neutral color tones, and the Imperial seal on one wall, which Veth Salas now looked at and thought about in a way he had not thought about it before. A seal was a claim about authority and reach and ownership. He looked at it on the wall, and then he looked at Osei walking into the room, and he thought about what that seal meant to someone who had spent 300 years being told by that seal that they did not exist. Osei looked at the seal for exactly 1 second, with an expression he could not name. And then she looked at the table. She sat down. At the head of the table, there were chairs along both sides, and a chair at each end. The chair at the head of the table was, technically, not designated. It was the same chair as all the others, physically. But rooms like this had physics of power, and the head of the table was where the person with the most authority sat. And that had always, in every meeting held in this room, been the highest-ranking Imperial officer present. She sat there before he could. Not fast, not rushed. She simply walked to it and sat down, the same way she did everything, with the total absence of apology, as if sitting there was the only logical place to sit. He stood for a moment. He thought about it. He sat in the chair to her left. Sora sat across from him. The diplomats found their seats. Osei's 2 companions settled beside her. She looked at him. He said, "Thank you for coming aboard." She said, "Thank you for the meeting." And then she opened one of the cases her people had brought, and she placed a document on the table and slid it to the center. It was old paper, physical paper, which almost nobody used anymore, which the Empire had not produced in any formal capacity for about 40 years. But it was well preserved, kept in the dark, kept dry, and it had writing on it in a dense, careful script that the translation matrix, running from his comm unit, began working on immediately. Our record, she said, of what happened. 300 years, kept as accurately as we could keep it. He looked at the document. He did not touch it yet. How many pages? He asked. That's the index, she said. The full record is in the case. We've brought copies. One for the station archives, one for the Imperial Archive if they'll accept it, one for the Council when it convenes. She paused. We were thorough. And he believed her. The negotiation that followed did not look like a negotiation. Negotiations looked like give and take. Someone offered something, someone else countered. Ground was traded, positions moved, and eventually a place in the middle was found that neither side was entirely happy with. That was negotiation. Both sides arrived with ranges. Both sides had things they were prepared to lose. Osei arrived with a list. The list was 4 items. She placed a second document on the table, a single page, and she slid it to the center, the same way she had slid the first one. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. She waited. He read it a third time, which was not because it was confusing. It was very clear. It was some of the clearest language he had read in his career. It was not full of legal hedging or diplomatic softening, or the kind of language that means 6 things depending on which side of the table you are on. It said what it said. 1. The Imperial Registry is to formally restore the designation Human, Terran, Sol 3, Earth, as an active recognized classification. This restoration is to be publicly announced and entered into all relevant databases within 90 standard days. 2. Imperial Administrative Decision Case 7.441 is to be formally acknowledged and publicly declared. Full declassification of all related files to follow within 180 days. And 3. 1 seat on the Imperial Council to be allocated to the remnant fleet, with full voting rights equivalent to any other council member. The seat to be occupied and its holder to be determined by remnant fleet internal process. 4. Nothing beyond the above 3 items. He looked up. 4 says nothing else, he said. Correct? There's no reparations claim. No territorial demand. No. The 3 items are the ask, she said. We're not interested in making it complicated. He looked at the list again. He was looking at it the way you look at a stone that has fallen through a window. You know what it is. You know what it means. You are just taking a moment with the fact of it before you deal with the consequences. These 3 things, he said carefully, will require council approval. The 3rd item especially, a new council seat. We know how your council works, she said. We've had a long time to learn it. It will take time. She looked at him with the particular expression she had that made time sound like a small and manageable thing. We know, she said. Sora spoke for the first time. The Admiral was a compact woman, silver-haired, 26 years in fleet command, and she had said nothing since they sat down. She had been listening in the specific, total way that very experienced officers listen, not waiting to speak, but collecting. The 47 ships, she said. Osei looked at her. You've been tracking them since yesterday, Osei said. Not a question. Since last night, Sora said. What class are they? We don't recognize the design. They're ours, Osei said. We built them. From what? The materials in your hull are colonial-era grade. We made do, Osei said. And for one moment, very brief, something moved across her face that Veth Salis almost missed. Not pride exactly. Something older than pride. Something that had a long history behind it. 300 years. Gives you time to learn things. Sora looked at her steadily. Are they armed? They're ships, Osei said. Ships are built to last. You build things to last when you know you might need them. That isn't an answer. It's the only answer that matters, Osei said. And she said it without hardness, without threat, in the same level tone she used for everything. We built them to survive whatever came next. Whatever came next is this meeting. She paused. So here we are. Sora looked at her for a long moment. She looked at Veth Salis. She went back to collecting. The meeting ran for 4 hours. In 4 hours, Osei did not change her list. She answered questions about it, hundreds of questions, from Veth Salis and Sora, and the 2 diplomats who had been very quiet for most of it, but began asking things in the 3rd hour, when they had caught up with where the conversation was. She answered every question in the same steady way. She explained the legal basis for the first item under 3 different frameworks. She explained what the second item would require, in practical terms. She explained the 3rd item's precedent in the early council records, when seats had been added before, and how it had been done. She had done her homework on imperial law in a way that the diplomatic staff found uncomfortable, because the diplomatic staff had expected to be the ones who knew imperial law. She knew it better than they did. This became clear around the 2nd hour, and after it became clear nobody tried to use procedure as a tool to slow things down, because it was obvious that procedure would not work that way in this room. "You've studied us," Vethsalis said, not accusingly, just noting it. "For 112 years, she said. "That we know of. Probably longer." "Why 112? She paused. The first real pause of the meeting, not a considering pause, but a personal one. Something she was deciding whether to say. "That's when my great-grandmother started keeping the formal record," she said, "of the registry checks. She thought if we were going to do this, we should document it properly." A pause. "She had 19 children. She wanted them to know why she was spending so much time at the communication array." The room was quiet for a moment. He thought about a woman, 112 years ago, sitting at a communication array in the dark of a colony that had been erased from every record, running a search she knew would return nothing, and doing it anyway, writing it down, leaving the record for her children. He thought about what that looked like repeated across 4 generations. "What was her name?" he asked. "Ama Ose," she said. He nodded. She looked at him with something that was not quite assessment but was close to it. "You're the first Imperial officer who's asked that," she said. He did not know what to say to that, so he said, "I'm sorry it took this long." She did not respond to that. She picked up her copy of the list and she folded it once and she placed it back in the case. The meeting was ending. He could feel it in the way the air in the room changed. At the door, before her people filed out, she stopped. She turned back to face him. "You're going to recommend acceptance," she said. "Or at least, you're going to recommend it go to council." "I can tell." He looked at her. "You can tell." "I can tell," she said. "You've been thinking about the answer since the second hour. People who are going to refuse stop listening around the second hour, because they've decided, and they don't need more information. You've been listening to everything." He considered this. "What if the council refuses?" he said. She looked at him. The same look she had given him on the screen 2 days ago, when he had asked the same question, in different words. The look of someone looking at a question that already had an answer. "Take your time," she said, and she left. He stood in the meeting room after they were gone. The document was still on the table, the index she had left. Physical paper, 300 years of record keeping, in a case being carried back to a shuttle. He looked at the document on the table and he thought about the case, and the full record inside it, and the generations of people who had maintained that record in the dark. Sora came to stand beside him. They stood in silence for a moment. "What do you think?" he said. Sora had commanded a fleet for 14 years. She had a long, professional relationship with clarity, and she did not waste words. "I think," she said, "that the 47 ships have not moved, and have not powered up, and have not broadcast a single threatening signal in 2 days. And I think that is more frightening than anything they could have done." She paused. "Because it means they don't need to threaten us. They already know what the math says. Can. He looked at the document. "I need to send a full report to the council," he said. "Yes. It's going to take time for them to convene." "Yes. She knows that. She knows everything we've told her, and some things we haven't," Sora said. "Send the report, and be honest in it." "I'm always honest." "Be honest about how it felt," Sora said, "to sit in that room. What it felt like to talk to her." She paused. "Because the council is going to need to understand what we're dealing with, and I don't think sensor data is going to cover it." He picked up the document from the table. Old paper. It was thicker than he had realized. The index alone was 30 pages. He thought about what the full record weighed. "Go," Sora said. "Write it." He went. The council chamber on the capital station was built to be impressive. It had been built 400 years ago, in the first decade of the Imperial expansion, when the founders had understood that rooms shaped decisions, and they had wanted decisions shaped in a particular way. The ceiling was high. The seats were arranged in a half-circle around a central speaking position. The lighting came from above, from narrow windows cut into the station's outer shell, and at certain hours the light hit the chamber floor at angles that had been mathematically calculated to look like consequence. It was a room that was very good at making people feel small. Vethsalis had been in this room 6 times in his career. The first time, he had felt what the room intended him to feel. By the 4th time, he had understood the room well enough to stand in it without being shaped by it. He stood at the speaking position now and he gave his report. It was long. He had written it carefully, the way Sora had asked, and he delivered it the same way. He reported the sensor data, the unclassified gray, the drive signature analysis, the hull material findings. He reported the first contact conversation, the translation matrix results, the language age estimate, what Osei had said, and how she had said it. He reported lens archive findings, the sealed file, the survey records, the coordinate cross-reference, the 3-sentence investigation report that had closed a file that should have been 40 pages. He reported the negotiation, the 4-item list, its clarity, the fact that nothing on the list had moved or bent across 4 hours of sustained discussion. He reported the 47 ships. He showed the sensor overlay, the formation pattern, the geometric precision, the perfect coverage of firing arcs, the total absence of hostile action in the 4 days since they had arrived. He talked for 1 hour and 20 minutes. The council listened. 41 members. Different species, different systems, different histories within the empire. Some of them he knew by name and record. Some of them he knew only by their faction alignments, which he had studied on the transport flight here because you did not come to a council meeting without knowing the room. When he finished, he stepped back from the speaking position and he waited. Counselor Vaughn spoke first. Vaughn represented the border systems, the sectors closest to where the Patience and its fleet had appeared. He was a tall man, with the careful economy of movement of someone who had grown up in lower gravity stations, and he had a reputation for speaking less than most counselors and meaning more than all of them. The archive file, he said. This administrative decision, case 7.441. Yes, counselor. You've confirmed the redactions are complete. There is no accessible text. Archivist Len is continuing to work on the secondary redaction layer, Veth Salas said. As of the time I left for this session, he had not gotten through it. But the surrounding documents make the nature of the decision. He paused. The surrounding documents tell a clear enough story. Vaughn looked at him steadily. Tell it plainly. Veth Salas had thought about how to say this on the transport flight. He had drafted several versions of it. He gave the shortest one. 307 years ago, he said, a colonial survey identified a species in the border sector. The species had 14 active colony clusters. They were logged, assessed, and determined to be by whoever made case 7.441 inconvenient. The record of them was sealed. The colonies went dark. The investigation that followed was 3 sentences long, which is not an investigation. It is a closed door. He paused. The people on those 47 ships are what happens when the door doesn't quite close all the way. Silence in the chamber. 3 factions emerged over the next 3 hours. The first faction wanted to refuse everything. This position was held by 6 counselors, led by Counselor Brait, who had spent his career on the Military Affairs Committee, and who looked at problems the way a hammer looks at things it is allowed to hit. His argument was strategic. Accepting the terms would set a precedent for other recovered or displaced populations to make similar claims. The council seat in particular was unacceptable. Adding a non-imperial voting member undermined the chamber's authority. He was consistent, and he was loud, and he was, Veth Salas thought, genuinely afraid, which was at least honest. The second faction wanted to negotiate, reduce the terms, accept the registry restoration, which was largely symbolic and manageable. Acknowledge the historical decision in softer language, express regret rather than formal declaration. Offer an observer seat on the council rather than a full voting seat, something that looked like acceptance while actually being significantly less. This was the largest faction, 14 counselors, pragmatists. Veth Salas listened to this faction and thought about Osei in the meeting room, who had studied imperial law for 112 years. Tu Ken, who had answered every procedural objection with more precision than the diplomatic staff could manage. He thought about the 4-item list that had not moved across 4 hours. He thought about offering a reduced version of the terms to someone who already knew exactly what the terms were worth. He did not say this during the session. He waited. The third faction was smaller. 8 counselors, including Vaughn, including 2 others who had spoken quietly during breaks, in a way that suggested they had been talking to each other before they walked into the room. Their position was simple. Accept the terms as written. All 4 items. Counselor Essa of the Academic Sciences spoke for this faction in the 3rd hour. She was elderly, with a precise voice that was used to cutting through noise. I want to address the precedent concern directly, she said, and the room settled, because Essa's voice had the weight of someone who had earned the room's attention over many years. Counselor Brait suggests that acceptance will invite similar claims from other populations. I would suggest to the Council that this logic requires us to believe there are other populations who have been erased from our registry by deliberate administrative decision, survived for 300 years in silence, built a fleet of 47 vessels without our knowledge, and waited until they were completely prepared before approaching us. She paused. If there are other such populations, that problem already exists, and our refusing these terms changes nothing about it. Brait began to respond. Furthermore, Essa continued, in the gentle, immovable way of someone who has not finished speaking, I would like the Council to consider what refusing means in practical terms. Not morally, practically. They have 47 ships, of unknown full capability, that have held position for 4 days without a single threatening act. They have demonstrated restraint beyond what most fleets would show when approaching a hostile posture. They have come to a table. They have placed a document on that table. The document asks for 3 things, the largest of which is a seat in this room. She looked around the chamber. I would like someone to explain to me what refusing a seat in this room accomplishes, compared to what it costs. Silence. Brait said, It costs us authority. Essa looked at him. We already lost that argument, she said simply. 300 years ago. The old general was named Harrow. He had not spoken since the session began. He sat in the back row of the council chamber, because general officers at council sessions were attending in advisory capacity, and sat in the back, and he had not moved from his position in 3 hours. He was 78. He had a long military history, and inside that history was a very specific interest in human strategic behavior, which he had studied as a young officer during a period when such study was considered academically interesting rather than practically urgent. In the 3rd hour, Brait called for a vote on a proposal to formally decline the terms and issue a counter-proposal through official diplomatic channels. Harrow raised his hand. The chamber recognized him. An old protocol advisory officers could speak before a vote if they raised a hand in the old way, the way that predated the current procedural rules. He stood. Slowly. I have a piece of history, he said, for the council's consideration, before the vote. He did not wait to be told to continue. At his age, he had stopped waiting for invitations that were already owed. 400 years ago, he said, in the very early expansion era, before the Empire had reached this station's coordinates, before most of you or your worlds existed in the Imperial record, there was a first contact encounter with a species in the central systems. He paused. That species walked barefoot across a continental landmass, their entire continent, coast to coast, to establish territorial claim over it. No ships, no weapons. They walked. It took 3 generations. They kept records of every step. He looked at the chamber. They were making a point, not to each other, to us, to the Empire that was watching. They wanted us to understand something specific about how they thought about problems. The chamber was quiet. I have spent my career reading military history, Harrow said, and in that reading I have found one consistent truth about species that survive catastrophic pressure events. They do not come out angry. Anger is a fuel, and fuel burns out. What they come out as is, he paused, looking for the word patient, organized, absolutely certain about what they want, and absolutely willing to outlast whatever is between them in getting it. He looked at Brait. We can refuse these terms. We can issue a counter-proposal. We can begin a negotiation process that might take months or years. He paused. They will wait. They have demonstrated, across 300 years, that waiting is not a hardship for them. It is a skill, and every month we spend refusing to sit in this room with them is a month they spend making their case better. He sat down. He did not say, vote against refusal. He did not have to. The vote came back 17-11 in favor of accepting the terms to take to the full council for formal ratification. This was not final acceptance that required a larger session, formal ratification, specific legal procedures, but it was a direction. It was the room deciding which way it was facing. Brait voted against. He looked at Vethsalis when the count was read, with the expression of a man who intended to continue objecting through whatever channels remained available. Vethsalis looked back at him calmly. He thought about a woman sitting at the head of a table she had not been invited to sit at, with her hands folded and her list unchanged, and 300 years of preparation behind her, telling him to take his time. He thought Braith's objections were going to be very quiet by comparison. He sent Ose the result at 0200. Audio only, brief. He summarized the preliminary vote, the direction the council was facing, the timeline for formal ratification. He told her it was not finished. He told her it was moving. She responded 12 minutes later. "We'll wait," she said. 2 words. Then, the line closed. He sat with those 2 words for a moment. He had expected something more. He had expected, he realized, relief. Or gratitude. Or some visible release of the tension that a 300-year wait should have accumulated. 2 words. "We'll wait." As if this was one more step in a process that had always had exactly this many steps, and they had always known it. He put the comm unit down. 3 days later, he stood at the station observation window and watched the patients undock. It pulled away clean. Running lights minimal. Drive signature warming in its particular old way, that the sensors still had no category for. He watched it move away from the dock, and he watched the space where it had been, which was empty, now in the way all recently vacated docks are empty, a clean absence where something had been. At the extended sensor range, the 47 dark ships began to warm their drives. He watched them come alive on the display, one by one, quietly, without announcement, no formation change, no repositioning, just drives warming, which meant they were preparing to move not away, not toward anything threatening, just preparing, getting ready to follow the patients, wherever the patients went next. His sensor technician Voss, still on shift, still near her drink, said quietly, "They've been there this whole time." "Yes," he said. "Doing nothing. Waiting," he said. She thought about this for a moment. 4 days, she said. Just holding there. He looked at the drives warming on the display. He thought about Len's archive. He thought about the subnote in a file that a careful redactor had missed, about a survey officer's small observation in a low-priority administrative field. Unusual persistence under adverse conditions. "They've had practice," he said. He wrote the final report that night. Every report he had ever written in 40 years had a field at the top labeled times, nature of incident times, and a field near the bottom labeled times, threat assessment. In 40 years, the Times Threat Assessment Times field had contained the same entry, none resolved, or times none ongoing monitoring recommended, or simply times none. He sat with the threat assessment field for a long time. The 47 ships had not fired, had not threatened, had not maneuvered. The patients had come to a table and placed a document on it and answered every question, and changed nothing on its list, and left when the meeting was over. No threat had been made. Not explicitly. Not in any language the Imperial Threat Assessment Code had a category for. He thought about what a threat looked like when it was 4 days of absolute stillness. When it was a woman who answered, "Take your time," instead of giving a deadline. When it was 47 ships that did not power up, because powering up was something you did when you wanted to communicate urgency. And they did not need to communicate urgency, because they had 300 years of patience sitting behind them like a wall. He typed in the Times Threat Assessment Times field. They didn't come angry. They came prepared. There is a difference. Learn it. He looked at the sentence. He considered deleting it. It was not standard language for the field. It was not measurable in the way threat assessments were supposed to be measurable. A senior review officer was going to read it and make a note in the margin. He submitted it anyway, because it was the only true thing he knew how to write in that field, and he had been honest in reports for 40 years, and he was not going to stop now for the sake of standard language. He picked up his tea. It was cold. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about cold tea and long waits and small things that stay with you. He thought about a woman named Ama Ose, 112 years ago, sitting at a communication array in the dark, running a search she already knew the answer to, and writing it down for her children anyway. He drank the tea cold, because it was there, and because it was his, and because small familiar things were still worth having, even when they were not warm. He closed the report. Outside the observation window, the last of the 47 drives finished warming. On the display, the formation began to move slow, precise, together following the patients away from the station and into the open dark. They moved like something that knew where it was going, like something that had always known, like something that had simply been waiting for the rest of the universe to be ready. He watched them go. The display returned to its familiar green. All registered contacts, all known signatures, all cataloged and filed and in their proper place. Except now, in the registry updated 2 hours ago by a technician in the records division, following a directive from the preliminary council vote, there was one new entry. Not a ship, not a station, a species. Human, Terran, Sol, 3, Earth. Status, active. He looked at that entry for a long time. Then he turned off the display and he went to sleep. For the first time in a week, he slept well.